Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to our webinar about this groundbreaking study that we did in partnership with Islam in Spanish on Latino attitudes toward American Muslims and Islam. My name is Delia Mogahid, and I serve as the Director of Research for the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. You can keep up with our work by checking us out on Facebook, X, or Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, and of course, Instagram. So what we are going to look at today is why we did this study to begin with. Why should we care about Latino views of Muslims? Then we'll dive into deep key findings and then have a panel discussion with some key stakeholders and then answer your questions. So why study Latino views of Muslims? The first reason is because of the Islamophobia index score that Latinos came out with when we looked at Islamophobia in the United States. And I'll go into what that means in a minute. The second is demographic realities of the large and growing segment of the American population that Latinos occupy. Third is the number of Latino Muslims is growing. It's the fastest growing segment of our community. And because of common challenges that the two communities intersect and share, and that we know that we have to study a community within its own diversity, and we know that Latinos are not a monolith. So first, looking at the Islamophobia index, ISPU created an index that measures how much the public endorses anti-Muslim stereotypes, and that's the Islamophobia index. And what we found is that Hispanic Americans or Latino Americans had the lowest score of any major ethnic or race group in the United States. And we wanted to understand why that was. Why was it that Latinos in America seem to have a sort of a defense or more inoculated against falling for anti-Muslim tropes in the mainstream? So this is another, another sort of dimension of that is we just look not only at how much, people endorse anti-Muslim tropes, but just there's favorability toward Muslims. We found that Hispanics score at 51% favorable, more than slightly more than a majority have favorable views toward Muslims, with only 10% saying they have unfavorable views and 39% with no opinion. So we're, more likely to be favorable, much more likely, 5 times as likely to be favorable than unfavorable, with a large chunk of people just with no opinion, suggesting that there's a lot of room for outreach and education. There's also the issue of growth in the proportion of Latino Americans. According to the Census Bureau, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. households report some kind of Hispanic origin. And studying Islamophobia among a group that represents such a significant portion of the population will present possible solutions and strategies that can be applied to the rest of the population in the United States. There's also growth, incredible growth in Latino Muslims. So according to ISPU's American Muslim poll, today, as of 2020, 9% of American Muslims identify as Latinos, compared to only 5% in 2017. And according to Gallup, in 2009, only 1% of Muslims identified as Hispanic. And by 2018, that number reached 7%. That was according to the ISPU poll, reflecting a 700% growth in less than 10 years, and no other group has grown that quickly. This growth points to possible increases in Latino-Muslim interactions, as well as common challenges between the two communities. So it was really critically important and time to understand how Latinos viewed Muslims and understood Islam. And then finally, we know that Latinos are not a monolith. They're ethnically and geographically diverse. There's various immigrant, generational, and citizenship statuses. And further research into this diverse group aids our understanding of the community as a whole. We couldn't be more proud to partner with IslamInSpanish, whose focus and mission is outreach and education to Latinos around the world, as well as in the United States, on Islam and Muslims. This publication was also made possible by generous support from Doris Duke and the Hibri Foundation, and we partnered with Latino Decisions, one of the top firms in the United States that does market research on Latinos, to do this research. Our advisors included Mujahid Fletcher, the founder and CEO of IslamInSpanish, and we're very proud that that Mujahid advised us and guided us during this research project, and also will be discussing the results during the panel. Zainab Ismail, founder of Fit for Allah, who's also with us to discuss the panel, and Wilfred Ruiz, Media Outreach Director at the Council on American Islamic Relations in Florida, CARE Florida. So I'm going to now switch it over to Alex to guide us through both the methodology and the key findings. He was one of the PIs, one of the primary investigators at Latino Decisions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that he can take over from here.
Hi, Talia. Thank you so much. So I think going into this study, we were mindful and very, mindful of the complexities and nuances that exist within the Latino community. And it begins with an understanding that it is an incredibly rich and complex community comprised of individuals from different parts and different countries of Latin America. So with that understanding, one of our focal concerns was how do we assess and how do we understand and come to understand the preferences and attitudes of this very diverse group. To that end, we structured our interviews in two different ways. One, which is conducting semi-structured interviews with Latinos that included 2 Latino Muslims. Now, the purpose of doing so was to try to inform our understanding and what are perhaps sources of influence and attitude with regard to Muslims in the United States. And in doing so, the first stage consisted of both men and women. There was one group entirely comprised of men and one group entirely comprised of women. The reasoning and the logic behind this design choice was to understand latent or perhaps underlying gender-based biases and misconceptions and perceptions that might be guiding and informing attitudes with regards to Muslims in the United States. These interviews cover topics such as their experiences interacting with other people from different backgrounds, their experiences with and perceptions of discrimination, and commonalities with American Muslims, as well as current political issues. Subsequently, from these initial in-depth interviews, we conducted focus groups, which were conducted between April and May of 2023, and there were 5 to 7 participants per focus group. During initial 8 focus groups, 1 group was all men and 1 group was all women, and 6 were mixed gender. And as well as these groups were also conducted in Spanish to those who prefer to speak Spanish. Now, this coincides with recent census work that found that of those that speak Spanish in the United States, 82% of Latinos are bilingual and 62% prefer to speak Spanish at home. So we wanted to make sure that our recruitment and our analytical strategies reflected these linguistic preferences, as well as they might speak to the sources of influence when it comes to attitudes with regard to Muslims and the perceived connections or commonalities with Latinos. Included in these discussions were a focus on the portrayal of both Muslims and Latinos in the media, as well as perceptions of Muslim women who wear a hijab. And during these focus group, participants were shown a short video about Islam to determine whether providing Latinos with information about Islam influenced their perception of American Muslims. And I think in this regard, it's important for us to take a moment and really discuss our choice to use Latino versus Latinx. Now, there are ongoing, crucial, and really, really important discussions about the choice to use one term over the other. And it is through our assessments of both in consultation with the literature as well as diverse perspectives within that literature that in everyday interactions and in everyday sources of information, Latinos by and large in the United States prefer the term Latino over the word Latinx. Now, that is not necessarily to stake a claim on the appropriateness of one over the other, but rather that at least for those participating in our study, that there was a clear preference for the term Latino. And therefore, moving forward, we'll be using that terminology. And we are obviously happy to discuss what are the perhaps implications of this experiment, this decision, and how it might influence our findings. To that end, we'll now move on to the factors contributing to lower levels of Islamophobia. First, based on our focus groups and our interactions with respondents, we found perhaps one of the most unifying factors and the unifying factors that tie the experience of Latinos in the United States with the potential experience of Muslims in the United States, and therefore we suspect might inform and explain lower levels of Islamophobia between the two groups, is perceptions of discrimination. And as a point of commonality, and part of our exercise was to ask Latinos what they immediately thought when they heard the word Muslim, and to what extent are those coincide or stand against the association and conceptions that come to mind when they hear the word Latino. And then the prominence of this theme is found throughout the interviews and the focus groups transcripts, which really lead us to conclude that this direct personal relationship with discrimination in the United States is a unifying factor in attitude with regard to Latinos. And it is that commonality, that sense of existing in the same social structure, that paves the way and it identifies and clarifies areas for collaboration between Latinos and Muslims in the United States. Specifically, and I'll point to a few specific comments by our respondents. For example, in one, when I think about the word Muslim, I just think about another brown person. That's another person who's brown, like me. That's my association. So there, when we look at perhaps prototypical indicators that might serve as a signal that these are individuals that might understand my perspectives in the United States, we see a common ground between Latinos and Muslims. Further, we see another respondent said, I feel like discrimination, speaking specifically to what are potential commonalities between the two groups, is that we can work together because people discriminate against Muslims and they discriminate against Latino people. We could communicate and work something out where we make people see that that's not bad. These aren't bad people, and they can show exactly how Muslim people are and how similar we are. So there, it underlies a connection as well as a willingness and a sense of solidarity of trying to clear and correct misperceptions. A second theme that was particularly insightful, at the same time interesting and surprising, was that partaking in the immigrant experience and in pursuit of the American dream were constitutive sources of influence in lower levels of Islamophobia amongst Latinos. Now, interestingly, this sense of connection through histories and pathways towards the country do not extend to a political domain. To that, I'll explain a little further. First, participants were often made the connection between their experiences as immigrants and the experience of American Muslims. And this connection was framed at the idea of wanting to pursue liberty and freedom, financial stability, and really making the most of opportunities to better oneself and one's life in this country, as well as prioritizing the family. as I mentioned, interestingly, this does not extend to a political rhetoric or a political talking point as we would expect, given the rhetoric that has dominated our political climate for the last 4 or 6 years. It was interesting that there wasn't a more localized connection between the immigrant experience and the way in which government elites and government actors frame that immigrant experience. And so we were surprised to learn that the perceived connection between immigration and immigrant history and the connections between Latinos and Muslims wasn't centered on a political influence. Instead, we do find that when asked about whether Latinos and Muslims could work together to solve problems, participants did not mention the issue of immigration. So this tells us that Latinos perceive a common immigrant experience within American Muslims based on a cultural and social basis rather than a political. And to illustrate, in one, they said they wanted to have, their own American dream, as well as be a homeowner, as well as be set financially. They also communicated frequently with their family, and they have strong ties back to their country of origin. So I feel that they have no different from anybody else. And we interpret that to mean that they're no different from us. They are no different from Latinos. And then it was important to highlight, and I'll just preview right now, that there is a sense that contact and prior history with Muslims really informs attitudes about Muslims. And that was really clear in several instances in which Latinos made reference to their personal friendships or connections. And for example, in one, they said, I have neighbors that are Muslims too, and they go to the pool, they have normal lives, they live normal lives. They are not different from anybody else. So that underscores the importance of drawing on those everyday experiences and allowing and creating opportunities for that interaction. A third theme is that interaction interaction with American Muslims and people from different backgrounds really drives and anchors global evaluations of Muslims. Our research found that exactly another base of support for the theory of contact hypothesis, which is basically interacting with people from different groups can attenuate prejudicial attitudes, and that participants in our study interacted with Muslim Americans across multiple institutional contexts, including school, work, and neighborhoods where they live. And exposure to different cultures is an important factor that shapes Latinos' attitudes about Muslims. To illustrate, in one respondent said, I grew up in Georgia, which is kind of known for having a Koreatown. Since then, I went to school first in Marietta, which has been a pretty large Black population. And then, one thing that I've noticed here at my university is there are a lot of Indians. So there's a lot of Hindus and Muslims. I've just generally been exposed to many different cultures growing up. I grew up around a lot of Italians and Pakistani people, and it's the same, communicating with another Hispanic for me. I don't even think about language. I don't think about religion. I just look at the person as a human being, So it is through that personal direct interaction that it makes individuals aware of and perhaps be open to correcting biases in their own way of thinking. And to that, we interpret as an opportunity to, again, influence and create opportunities for that interaction. And for the sake of time, I'll continue to our next theme, which is that religion and religiosity are a strong source of perceived commonality and positive attitudes. With regard to religiosity, there's a clear through line that those in which that exhibit strong or high levels of religiosity are the ones who perhaps have the strongest positive attitude of Muslim Americans. For example, when discussing their husband's colleague, one respondent said, I have had a lot of conversation with him about religion, and I'm Catholic, Christian, and I found out that we have a lot in common in our beliefs. And embedded in that statement is the sense of reverence and admiration for another cultural ethnic group that has similar underlying religious commitments. They believe in Allah, and I don't know much about the religion itself, but I do know that they're very dedicated. I tell you, I'm impressed by the dedication and the devotion that they show to their religion. And that in itself is a very interesting thing. Further, another respondent said, so from this side, without knowing much about their religion, I admire them because they are people who are faithful to their beliefs. And so it's not just a shared sense of commitment to religion and spirituality. There's something specific and a specific response to Islam that they find is analogous and very similar to devotion in other religions. For example, there are clear, when asked about, when probed about perceived similarities between, for example, Christians and Muslims, one respondent said, actually, it has a lot of similarities to the Christian religion, a lot of similarities. And another respondent noted that there are just nuances that differentiate them, but ultimately, they're similar enough to anybody looking from the outside. So there, again, it reiterates this sense of kinship, this sense of in-group distinction and out-group polarization. And given what we've already discussed, which is pathways towards creating that sense of commonality, then it identifies religion, or perhaps a commitment or a sense of religiosity, as the basis of that future connection. Further, there's a sense that knowledge plays an important factor in those experiences, and that the knowledge and the information that they get out of it that really structures future orientations about those relationships. And in this regard, I will move forward to the remaining work that has to be done, which through these focus groups and these in-depth discussions, in-depth interviews, we did identify several potential factors that may potentially skew the positive impressions of Muslim Americans in the United States. First, Islamophobia manifests through perceived misogyny. Now, again, although Latinos did rank very low on the Islamophobia index, there was a common theme, which is perceptions of misogyny within the Muslim faith that explains these lower levels. Specifically, there is a perceived mistreatment of Muslim women by Muslim men. As one respondent noted, Muslim women live in fear. You know, that there's fear, and it's the same thing, you know, I'm Cuban, it's the same thing as in Cuba, you know, we live in fear of the government. I think Muslims, probably the women, are more fearful of men because they're not looked at as, you know, they're not equal, and I say it exactly right, not equal. So there's a specific connection between a through line that they see, that Latinos see within their own culture, that they also see in Muslim culture. And so there's this perceived mistreatment of Muslim women that may explain higher levels of Islamophobia in this regard, in this specific domain. So again, it underscores the importance of future messaging campaign to really give context. And later on, I will explain what I mean by give context. Another example is patriarchy in Islam. As one respondent said, the Old Testament is the same as the Bible and the Quran and the Torah. We share that. And I know that most of the Muslim people I know that they shelter very much, their wives and everything. And I know that some of them can be very, I will say, protective. And so there was a lot of different ways to try to describe this level of perceived patriarchy in Islam that was particularly concerning specifically amongst Latina respondents. And for the sake of time, I will just make note, and this report is available so that if there's interest to try to understand the specific descriptions. But first is that there are clear comparisons between Catholicism and Christianity to Islam, and as well as the comparisons to machismo in culture, Latino culture. There were parallels drawn between this sense of perceived misogyny as well as level of control by men over women that Latinos could see in their own culture, but they also could identify or perceive to identify in Islam. A second theme is stereotypes of Muslims as violent or terrorist. When prompted or asked how do they feel are the portrayals of Latinos and Muslims in media, there was a clear consensus that Muslims were portrayed as violent, extremists, and terrorists. And this is in line with prior research where we understand that there's a definite negative portrayal of Latinos and Muslims in media, and it proliferates, and it's made known amongst respondents. And specifically, respondents could identify media as a key factor in shaping their negative stereotypes. So again, a level of awareness that underscores the potential for action to try to remedy that and try to increase the level of positive portrayal of both Latinos and Muslims as a way to correct those biases. A third theme is that religion and religiosity as a point of difference. Although we noted that there are clear parallels perceived between Christianity and Islam, there are perceived differences as well that might be might separate them, but still nevertheless feel that there is an opportunity for Christians and Muslims to have a sense of commonality. I won't go into the details, but like I said, the view that Christians are more accepting of others than Muslims, this idea that there's something fundamentally different between those of the Muslim faith and those of the Christian faith. And to that end, I'll briefly note that perceptions that Islam is different, that their Muslim religion seems a little bit more legalistic in the sense that you have to pray 5 times a day. I don't see Christians praying 5 times a day. I fast when I pray, but to go a whole month fasting from sunset to sundown, it's really tough. Once they start putting a whole lot of restrictions, and I don't know, it goes from religion to something else. So there again, these attitudes are deeply entrenched on perceived understanding of Islam and the Muslim faith, that it allows us to really think about ways in which we might mitigate Islamophobia and we might mitigate these misconceptions through education. And as part of this study, we leverage the existing resources that are available to IslamInSpanish and see how is it that respondents would perceive or kind of respond to real-time information about Islam. To that end, there was a short informational video about the 5 pillars of Islam that was produced by IslamInSpanish, and participants were asked about their knowledge of Islam prior to the video. And then once they were showed that video, a follow-up question was whether participants learned anything new about how it impacted their views. And we did find really strong and fascinating insights, which is first that after watching the video clip, participants were more likely to perceive Islam as similar to other faiths. So it speaks to this idea and the potential success of providing information and as a way to correct misconceptions, or really providing information that respondents didn't have. Further, exposure to credible and sound educational materials can indeed help mitigate Islamophobia. As well in this study, and we took careful attention to the gender nuances that were discovered and revealed through our discussions, which is how is it that we can bring to the fore these attitudes and misconceptions about gender with regard to Muslim women. And in this focus group, we allowed respondents, we created a focus group specifically comprised of women, and we showed them a video clip of Dalia explaining hijab on a daily show. And it was interesting to see the response. And one respondent, and it's important to note this, that one respondent said, "This is the first time in my 39 years that I see a lady with a hijab talk that way. You know, like I've always, in the long history of Islam, it's always been negative, you know. So I guess I'm glad that I got to see that. It kind of just changes my perspective." So it speaks to the need to have greater representation of Muslims on the media, but as well as specifically featuring particular perspectives and narratives that are typically excluded from dominant and mainstream media. And the importance of really focusing on women's voices. And as I mentioned, the final focus group ended with a conversation between participants and a Latina woman who wears a hijab. And she was able to really describe her personal experiences, what it means to wear a hijab, what it means to be Muslim. And the impact of it was clear. The respondents in this focus group were excited and really, in fact, they actually held the focus group over because they were excited to take advantage of this rare opportunity to ask questions that they've never been able to ask. And finally, when we look at the recommendations, as I've gone throughout this discussion, which is the idea that there's a clear need to improve outreach to Latino community, that the views of American Muslims are not deeply entrenched or crystallized, but rather they can be improved and they can be corrected. And so it really underscores the areas of focus, which is the diversity of American Muslim communities, as well as what are pathways to spotlighting that diversity and creating opportunities for interactions, as well as develop effective educational materials and activities both in English and in Spanish. As we saw from our focus group, that there's a strong response to these informational materials, and it underscores the need and the greater need for them. And then finally, that we have to create there's a need to create opportunities for interpersonal interactions between Muslims and Latinos. And to that, the panel discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. Kat, if you could open my video so we can get started. Great. Thank you so much, Alex, for that excellent presentation of a lot of information in a short time. I encourage everyone to check out the report where there's even more detail and more examples of quotes, direct quotes from respondents. It's really, really rich information that I think you'll find a lot of value in. I just wanted to, reflect on what I found so interesting in these focus groups and in this research is that religion and Muslims' perceived religiosity or devotion to Islam was both something that people admired and something that some people found alienating. And I find that very interesting in that there's no one way to be except yourself. So when outreach has to be authentic, has to be yourself, and those who are going to be drawn to who you are will come, and those who might find it too much, you might be too much for them. Sometimes you cannot please everyone. I also think it was so important for us to discover the value of women's voices in the representation of Islam and telling the story. And I'm very excited to start this conversation with Mujahid and with Zainab about the results. And I'm going to start with you, Zainab. An area, as we heard, an area of genuine concern in this research among Latinos was their perception that Muslim women's voices were not heard, that they were dominated or suppressed by men. And it was so transformational for just those few people who got to talk to you at that focus group. And I'd love for you to tell us about your experience at that focus group, what the discussion was like, and then just overall your experience as a Latina Muslima.
Thank you so much, Dalia. I am so grateful and honored that ISPU did this research and included me and my voice as a born and raised New York Puerto Rican Muslim. I've been Muslim for almost 15 years. And when I went into the focus group, I said to myself, like you just mentioned, I'm going to be Zainab that I am and answer their questions openly, be totally transparent, and give them an experience that they may never have had. And that really was where the shift of the conversation went. It really steered towards, what is my experience as a Muslim woman in America, a Latina Muslim woman? Why do I wear hijab? What made me wear hijab? And there was a lot of questions really geared towards hijab. And I really just highlighted for them first and foremost, as soon as I came out the gate, I gave them a full Puerto Rican greeting in Spanish, and then we shifted to English because there were some participants that preferred to just speak in English, and they were so surprised, let alone a Muslim woman. They had just seen the video with you speaking on the Daily Show, and they were like, wow, you're Puerto Rican, you speak Spanish. They just wanted to know more about me and my experience. I expressed first and foremost that Muslims, just as Latinos, we are not a monolith. And also in terms of practice, there's a vast difference in levels of where everyone is in their practice. And I think recently I tried to quote some ISPU research about the percentage of women that actually wear the hijab, which for them was astonishing that it was, in their eyes, a significantly low number. And I kind of went on the like 30 to 33% of Muslim women in America wear the hijab full time, which really took them back. So I said, a lot of times you may encounter someone, and more likely than not, if they're Muslim, you may not be able to tell because their outward appearance isn't going to denote the badge of honor, I call it, the hijab. And then I did go into explaining, because there are questions about my experience in hijab, is explaining that hijab is more than just the headscarf. It extends to our manners, our behaviors, our interactions with others, how we treat people, how we treat nature, creation, all of the things that we're surrounded by. So it's not just this headscarf, but this is what the media and news has really portrayed as this one symbol of being a Muslim woman. And they really appreciated that I was able to just really explain to them, I am the same person that I was before I was Muslim, with the exception of the things that are no longer permissible for me to do, meaning they don't conform with our beliefs and or the things that God is asking of us, and that we're really striving to be better human beings. So that conversation really, then the ladies were like, so what was the turning point for you? So now they really were more invested in me and hearing my story. And so what was the turning point for you? What really made you become Muslim? And what was interesting, before I go into that, is that many of the ladies that were in the focus group new Muslims, had Muslim family members, someone dated a Muslim, someone was married to a Muslim. So many of them did have experiences, some of which were negative based on their interaction, like Alex mentioned in many of the slides. And also some people had really amazing experiences. And then there were the few that had never really had any experience. So when I was about to dive into my personal, very personal, like answers to something that not even with my own family have they asked me these questions. I really just delved deep into like the authenticity of my story, my truth of what made me become Muslim. And then they wanted to know, well, what were the challenges? What did you face? What was difficult? And to their surprise, again, my experience is going to be very individual, as everyone's journey is very individual, because I am in New York City, where there's probably close to 500,000 Muslims. So it's a lot more visible in every corner of New York City. We have neighborhoods that are fully areas that are in Arabi and, full on South Asian communities. So it's not out of the norm. But they were just really surprised at what was challenging for me, whether it be with friendships and with my job or the things that I do. So they really just wanted to know, like, tell us more about you. We want to know about you. And I think that through the questions, they got a sense of like, wow, you're doing it the way you want to, according to your faith. And I think that was probably the biggest takeaway for them, that Muslims are so vast, let alone now we have Latino Muslims. So this is like something we really have to learn more about. And that would probably be one of the biggest takeaways, is that the information that they have readily available hasn't allowed them to understand that we are not a monolith as well, and that we are a growing population, especially as was mentioned from the slides, that Latino Muslims are the fastest growing community within Islam, especially in America. And I just really loved the experience. It was very rewarding. I got a little emotional because at the end, I just really said to them, I have dedicated my life to doing humanitarian work in several Spanish-speaking countries, working with these Muslim communities in these countries where they are very much the minority. And for me, uplifting the voice of our people, and when I say our people, I mean Latinos, that really for me is the greatest intention that I have made in this journey. And I hope that this research serves as a benefit to the greater community of Muslims as well as non-Muslims, so that we can move forward and educate each other more so that we do have an understanding that we are a lot more alike than we are not alike.
Thank you so much. Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much, Zainab, and really so grateful for your willingness to share so generously of yourself in this project and in the focus group. I know that it was transformational for those who were able to attend.
Thank you.
I'm going to now switch to Mujahid. We've had the pleasure of working with you on this project and learning more about your work at Islam in Spanish. Really, this project is meant to feed into your work. I was so struck by how much the video that you produced really opened people's eyes, and it's very basic, simple information about fundamental beliefs within the Muslim community and Islam. What will this research mean to your work, and what surprised you the most, Mujahid?
Assalamu alaikum, Dalia, and thank you so much to you and your team at ISPU, everyone who came together for this great research. I just would like to start by saying, as a person who was not Muslim growing up, I knew almost nothing about Islam and Muslims until like the age of 21. And when embracing Islam, it was 3 months before September 11th. So I kind of was asked to speak in front of the Spanish media when I was trying to look for a career path at that age. And I realized that the Muslims not only had a huge responsibility to speak to the general public at that time after September 11th in the English language, but in the Spanish language, it was really underserved. We didn't really find material, and it was my father who pointed out a lot of these gaps. And so after embracing Islam and realizing that, we have this language, we come from a people who are growing here in America. It was really my father who told me, hey, you should produce this material. And so I went to study media. And after studying media, a lot of what we did with Islam in Spanish preliminarily was just projects in school. But we started seeing an effect. And the first CD produced, it was given to my wife's aunt, who was very Christian. She was very religious. And she was very upset that we became Muslim because she thought my wife wearing hijab, it meant that I was oppressing her. And me as a new Muslim, I didn't even know why she put on the hijab, because I'm new in Islam. And all of this is happening at once. And then the media is asking questions, asking, how American I can be if I'm Latino and Muslim, and so many different things. Fast forward 22 years later is the first time that we have data to now ground a lot of what our experience has been for 22 years. And the production of media for us was the only way that we could offset the need to educate people, because Latinos are few in number. So we utilize mass media production in order to disseminate some of the findings that we, as people who didn't know about Islam, found out. So, we would find something out, we'd produce it. And so now with this research, what it allows us to do is look at some of the things that we found out organically through grassroots outreach and media production, and now looking at the data. So some of what stands out to me is I didn't know that Latinos had the lowest index of Islamophobia, but it makes sense because when you look at Latinos and Muslims, they're either being targeted or discriminated, trying to be marginalized. And so when two groups of communities feel the same aches and pains, they kind of, without knowing, they kind of look at each other as normal, quote unquote, like, I get where you're coming from. I get what's happening with you. And through a study ISPU did in 2019, I believe, the Muslim poll, I was shocked to see that Latinos are usually people who may have a Muslim friend. And I grew up in Alief, in Houston, in a neighborhood where now that I became Muslim, I saw a lot of people in the mosque that I grew up with in these schools. So the lowest Islamophobia index, along with the most favorable view regarding the Latino community, if 51% of the Latino community in this study say something that now give us data to understand that they have a favorable view towards Muslim, these are people that somehow, because of shared historical roots, possibly because Muslims governed Spain for almost 800 years, Spain went and conquered a lot of the lands of Latin America. And so there's a lot that we find in the culture of Latinos coming from Islam. So in IslamInSpanish, we developed a signature program called Islamic Roots in the Latino Culture, where we extracted 3,000, 4,000 Spanish words that come from the Arabic language, a lot of our customs. So when we explain this to the people while we're serving food, so that everybody can come and know each other, right, at one of our centers in Houston or Dallas, or as we travel, people get to know one another. And then Muslims and Latinos start realizing that, wow, there's a lot more in common that we didn't know about each other. So seeing this research, it's almost like simplifying the messaging of what we've been doing offline. And when it comes to the media production, it's shocking how when you produce a piece of content, it could travel online now to all the different continents, while you sleep. And so a video about hijab in the Spanish language from a Latin American young sister who embraced Islam in Colombia, okay, was filmed here in Houston because she found out about Islam somehow online, tracking back to IslamInSpanish content, somehow got married with a brother who happens to be from Houston, ends up here in Houston. And when we're looking at the demographic of a young Latina sister who wears hijab, for her to explain her experience, when we produced that video, people all over Latin America were just sharing it. These are people who are not Muslim. And it may have a lot to do with what Sister Zainab mentioned. They're very curious, they're interested. And we need to improve the outreach. And I'm hoping that this presentation assist the Muslim community to understand the importance of the Latino community. It's not that we're going back to this community because we come from them. It's because we have a lot of commonalities and we have a lot of challenges that we share. And if we're able to come together as a community, there's a significant number there of representation of the US population alone, with Latinos being 1/5 of the US population, and with statistics saying that by the year 2050, 1 out of every 3 Americans will be Latino. It's in our best interest as a community to invest in this potential 33% of the US population so that the day that we hope never comes, okay, something similar to what I witnessed when I became Muslim, such as September 11th, a lot of chaos and messaging, people didn't know each other, were afraid from each other. I'm hoping that if we do a better job with this demographic, that at minimum, when our kids go to school, when we go to the workforce, the Latinos there will realize that we're not a threat to America, but we're an asset because of what we share in common, the good. And to end with this, I mean, to see that there's a Gallup poll that shows that there's, in the last decade, 10 years, about 700% increase of Latinos embracing Islam. When you look at the fastest growing ethnic community in America, being the fastest growing embracing Islam, this trend here should lead us to believe as Americans, beyond just the Muslim community, in society, that we need to know one another. And this is one of the beauties of Islam in general, that, it is in the Quran, a verse, for us to get to know one another, right? Not to despise one another, because when we get to know one another, we get to know our differences, commonalities, but the deeper sense is that we get to know each other at a human level. So I think it's amazing that this research was carried out with regular everyday people. Latino Decisions, we're very happy that they specialize in the demographic that we really needed to understand, ISPU understanding the Islamophobia index. Since those incidents of September 11th, we have a kind of the same amount of years that we've been doing this work, since that incident there. So it's really amazing to see this come together. And now when the media ask us for some data, whenever Dean of Education, of a university asks us for data, now we have the ability to share some of that with them, because until now, we've spoken to the Pew Research, we've spoken to many of the different sources that people go to, to look for data, and there's just very little. So there's a lot that we can uncover, and we just hope that we can become better human beings, the best American that we can be, the best Latino we can be, the best Muslim we can be. And by getting to know each other, we'll realize that, we can complete one another to look at our children and grandchildren and the future generations, to do the best job that we can, in this very interconnected world, but also isolated world at the same time. So we'll go on to inform our programs and projects for the grassroots outreach in Islam in Spanish based on the study now, and simplify its messaging. That's what we plan. And we are going to focus more on the area of producing stories as well as educational material. And we look forward for this. It's like a leveling up of the work. So we really appreciate the survey.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mujahid. And, what you mentioned about ISPU, I just want to let everyone know who might not be familiar with our organization. Our mission is to inform dialogue and decision-making on the American Muslim community. We specialize entirely on research concerning American Muslims and the policy issues that impact this community, as well as how this community is viewed by various groups and communities within the United States. So this is our specialization and where you should come if you want information on American Muslims. I'd love to now invite Alex and Zainab back on, where we're going to now be taking audience questions. And I'm going to start with you, Alex, because there are a couple of questions just asking about the background of the panelists, the background of those who were a part of the focus group. One asking, were there any Black Latinos that were part of the study? And another just asking about the different demographic variables in terms of immigration, status, geography, Spanish speaking versus not. Could you just comment a little bit about the demographic of the focus group respondents?
Yes, absolutely. So first, we did not have individuals that indicated that they identified as Black, but we were mindful of the fact that that is in and of itself we suspect, and based on existing literature, that it's a powerful evaluative lens that may structure interactions with Latinos and Muslims. So we don't mean to discount that at all, but that within the sample of respondents, that was not necessarily that wasn't a demographic that we structure. Since this is a first step in the research, that is definitely something we may consider in the future. Now, in terms of the demographic composition of our sample, that is also that we try to be mindful of the complexities and the differences that exist within the Latino community. And to that end, for example, I'll briefly say that in terms of the in-depth interview IDIs, we had pairwise distributions between Mexican respondents, Puerto Rican respondents, and Dominican respondents. And those are the three largest groups according to the U.S. Census. So we're pleased that we were able to capture that diversity in those distributions. Further, a majority, we had a pretty good representation from different age groups. For example, 22% of our respondents were between the ages of 25 and 34. 44 were from 35 to 44, and then the remaining 33 were from 45 to 50. So we had a really, really good distribution. We had pairwise distributions between genders, as well as although the majority of our sample was Catholic, we did have representation from those that identified as evangelical. And I think in terms of the partisan distribution, it was equal across the three across Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. And to answer the question of a regionality, we did have, for example, 44% of our sample of the IDIs were from the South, 34% were from the Midwest, and 22% were from the Northeast. And then going further into the focus groups, we had similar distributions. First, we had, like I said, we had Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Dominicans. And in terms of the regions, we had 28% that were from Northeast, 14% were from the Midwest, 41% were from the South, and then nearly 20% were from the East Coast, from the West Coast. So we had really, really great distribution across different samples.
Great, thank you. One other question that I think that you can help us with is, there's a question that asking about any significant differences in attitudes toward Muslims between the English-speaking focus groups and the Spanish-speaking focus groups. And that was also a question that I believe Islam in Spanish had. So I wanted you to address that.
So surprisingly, it makes perfect sense, and it's intuitive to think that in a number of regards, for example, discrimination that occurs for speaking a language other than English in public, the opportunities for interactions between non-English speaking Latinos and perhaps even non-English speaking Muslims in the United States, how those could be sources of difference and distinctions between the two, and might be a factor in driving attitudes with regard to Muslims. But from our perspective, we did not see any clear differences between language groups, or perhaps that you could say that language was a constitutive factor in shaping opinion, either through information ecosystems or not. And like, as I mentioned, at the start of our presentation, is that nearly 80% of those that speak Spanish in the United States are bilingual. So it's not, I don't think you could say that it's a language barrier is necessarily a prevalent factor that sorts people in one environment versus the other. And further, you could, for example, there's a logical presumption that language acquisition and language preferences are really a proxy for generational status and immigrant group status. But again, according to the census, those that are, for example, born in the United States are as likely to speak Spanish as those that have been in the US for most of their life. And I think that speaks more to the fact that there's ongoing flows and waves of immigrants coming to the United States that sustain the very social structure that incentivizes the retention of language, as opposed to in comparison to other groups where there's been a need to acculturate and they abandon those linguistic particulars. But Latinos, at least in the United States, present a unique trajectory, which is the constant flow of immigrants retains those linguistic dimensions. And so from the responses, even though we did make, our study did make opportunities for Spanish as well as English language interviews, there weren't any clear differences across language groups.
And then just one more regarding differences. Folks are asking about generational differences, millennials versus baby boomers. Did you find a difference in sort of like a trend or a divide between generations regarding their views of Islam and Muslims?
So I think there were some, in terms of like for example, I think it was their willingness to express attitudes that may or may not be, it was a clear difference in a willingness to share attitudes that may or may seem controversial. In that regard, older respondents seem to be more forthcoming and sharing their views, and they seem to be much more entrenched in their willingness to share those views. But in terms of whether, and further, like for example, younger respondents typically lived in more in areas like in larger cities, and they had, for example, relative to the older respondents, they are the ones who had the most interactions with Muslims in the city, for example, just as their neighbors or that they interacted with at work. And so I think in that regard, age played a factor in that younger people had more opportunities to engage the world. They're more likely to go to school. They're more likely to go to work. they're more likely to have a more active presence in their community, whereas older respondents are much more insular. Their social networks are a lot smaller, and in that sense, the experience that they have at their formative age is stay with them. And so there's a really interesting dynamic. On the one hand, younger respondents have the most potential for interactions, and they are the ones who are more susceptible, more willing to kind of correct their biases, as opposed to older respondents that have fewer opportunities for interactions, and they are the ones who anchor their evaluations based on those early priors.
Thank you. Mujahid and Zainab, I'd love to hear your response to what this sounds like to you. Is the result, are the results that Alex is talking about resonate, or is that your experience in interacting with folks in your context? One is in New York, one is in Texas, so slightly different cultural context within the Latino community. How much does this reflect your own personal experience? I'll start with you, Zainab.
Thank you. I do think that here in New York City, it would be much more realistic to say that your Gen Z and your millennials are going to have a lot more exposure to Muslims, given the surroundings, school, university, work, and the things that they're doing that they might engage, whether it be, for example, I watch this dynamic even in the gym setting. The gym setting is primarily Gen Z, millennials, some Gen X, and I see how different demographics working out with several of the younger Muslim men. You'll see they've all gone to school together, so they don't really have it. There's no difference for them, especially here in Brooklyn, where we are really a vast melting pot. So you have everyone under the sun going to all the same stores, going to all the same fitness centers, taking the subway together. So there really is a lot more interaction with the younger folks versus, say, the Gen X and up, and definitely the baby boomers.
Yeah. What about you, Mujahid?
So we're in the south of the country, right? Being in Texas, the largest population that we'll have of Latinos will be from Mexico. And it's right next door to Mexico. So we share the border, right, with Mexico. So it makes sense. The neighborhood where I grew up in is 43% Latino. And that's where we went back and established the IslamInSpanish Centro Islamico, which is the only Latino-led Islamic center in America. And what we have found, not only on average are approximately 100 people embracing Islam a year, but why they end up coming is because as a community, you have from the youngest to the oldest, some sort of a need to set up programming based on age demographic, as well as considering language at times. So, for example, the newcomers to America, those people who just got here, they're going to have a language barrier because they just arrived. It's totally different than someone who is considered a quote unquote Chicano, which is not only a person from Mexico, but they're like 3 generations back Mexican. You look at that demographic in San Antonio, for example, which is about 2.5 hours away from Houston. You look at the people and their skin color, their attributes and culture can look to be Latino, but Chicanos 3-4 generations down the line in a place like San Antonio more than likely will not speak Spanish because they have integrated into, this landscape here, which is diverse. So Houston is 44% Latino as a city, and it's the 3rd largest city in the United States. So according to some research at Rice University by Dr. Kleinberg, Stephen Kleinberg, he speaks about the grain and the browning of America, right? The older that America gets, the more brown it becomes. So when you look at just ethnic skin color, you may be confused sometimes when you come to our community because we have very, dark Afro-descendant people in our community that happen to be from Colombia, for example. A whole coast of Colombia, everyone, they're Afro-descendants. And when they come here to America, they may be confused as an African-American. And then we get into, are they not African-American? They're from Latin America, which is America as well. So there's a lot of complexity in regards to where people come from, their language proficiency regarding the amount of time that they've been here, as well as their integration into society, or assimilation, right? They either become like everyone else, or they stand out and become very unique and distinct from everyone else, which means that they're in the nucleus of people who are like them, speak like them, and look like them. So with this sort of research and the amount of coverage there is in this percentage, Puerto Ricans, and Sister Zainab, mashallah, is a good representation of this. In the East Coast, I found to be a good majority, right? So when I come to Texas, Puerto Ricans are not going to be the majority. It's from Mexico. So I'm so glad that there is a mix of people from the East Coast, Midwest, South, because now we can kind of look at these patterns and then understand generalities. And I think that that's the most important thing in a qualitative study, if I'm not mistaken, such as this. It helps us refine our approach regarding messaging and just conceptualizing things. So I think we have to be keen on the data and its representation of what it means, and understand that this was not a quantitative study. It's not about looking at how many people such and such, or percentages of the population, which is a different type of study. So I appreciate this approach, and I think for its purpose, I think it met its purpose, and it really will inform our work, as well as we can inform the community about these nuances, which are sometimes technical. And we've spoken about this for Rice University and the sociology department for the last 8 years. They invite us every year to talk about this. And if it's an Ivy League school like the Harvard of the South, and they are not aware of these nuances, I would assume that the majority of people in America are not. So it's great discussing this.
And it underscores the need for further research. And as you mentioned, quantitative research would get at some of these differences numerically between generations or between, national origin and so forth. I'm going to wrap up with one final question, and I'd love for Zainab and Mujahid to comment on this, and that's regarding the role of other Muslim communities who are not Latino and their responsibility to do this work of outreach. What would you advise to communities around the country who don't have a sizable Latino presence in their Muslim community? How should they respond and react to this kind of research? What is their role? And Zainab, you can start, okay?
I think it's really important to recognize that convert care as a whole is something that is a communal obligation. And in my experience traveling around the country, it's something and in a place where we fall short, and many communities are just very distanced from the reality of who's becoming Muslim. So I think it's important that at the mosque level, that these conversations start to happen, whether it be at the national conferences, so that there's more awareness at the more local level, because there's really not that many resources or people doing this work. There's pockets of different places, obviously, where Mujahid is, Islam in Spanish, but here on the East Coast, for example, we really don't have anything that's targeted specifically towards Latino new Muslims. There are areas in New Jersey where there's greater population of new Muslims that are coming in that are Latino. But in general, I think at the larger, like the ISNAs, the ICNAs, the MAS, all of these different larger organizations, there needs to be a little bit more emphasis on possibly adding a Spanish panel, a bilingual panel, some kind of interaction, not just like as an afterthought, but even on the main stage, that there be some inclusivity with the people that are already present in the space of convert care, and in particular Latino Muslims, so that the greater population starts to have more awareness. Because when I speak to people, or I go and I speak at different mosques up and down the East Coast, or in the Midwest, or even in the Bay Area, say in California, they're very perplexed on what do we do and where do we start? And I'm like, it's just like any other programming that you have implemented. You have to start from the ground and hear what the people have to say, and start small, because convert care is very overlooked in general across the board.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Mujahid?
So I guess the question is, the communities that don't necessarily have a high population of Latinos, is that correct?
Yeah, within the Muslim community, they may have Latinos around them that aren't Muslim, but what should they be doing?
Excellent. We had a program over a decade ago. We went all around the nation, and we carried out this program for the Muslim community, entitled "What Do Your Neighbors Think of You and Why?" And towards the end, I role played acting as a person who's not Muslim with those who were in attendance after the presentation. And I would say, look, I'm a neighbor down the street, and I am just finding out a little bit about Islam, but you guys have been down the street and I never knew you guys, right? So who wants to role play? And so somebody would stand up and I'd say, hey, you know, I see a lot of cars out here every Friday, but what do you guys do? I just found out about something. Is this true? The majority of people that we interacted with throughout all the different mosques literally or simply did not know how to simply have a discussion and conversation. They would react and say, well, what the media says about Islam is not true. And then I would say, well, I'm not talking about the media. I'm just asking because I live down the street. They were just throwing out things that bothered them, but it had nothing to do with what, you know, I as a neighbor wanted to know about them. So at bare minimum, we have to look at each other as people who live in one country. You know, we are sharing some similar legislation in this country or resources, whether we live in a neighborhood or a city or a state. It's in our best interest to get to know one another. And I don't think as a Muslim community is healthy whenever the largest growing demographic, you know, is knocking on the door saying, hey, I want to know, and then we're not speaking to them. Like, what does that mean? And then, as Sister Zainab mentioned, what happens whenever the people do embrace Islam, sometimes not even being educated by Muslims, just based on what's online, and they show up and they say, I want to become Muslim. A new Muslim assumes that as a community, you have everything laid out for them to enter Islam. The resources, the step-by-step, the mentorship, the guidance. And whenever we embrace Islam, we show up and we say, wow, there's not even material. How am I going to talk to my parents about this? So we have these gaps that the Muslim community needs to compensate for over a period of years. But instead of us poking holes at this, what we try to do with Islam in Spanish is actually create those resources. And instead of talking about the problem, basically pioneer solutions. But those solutions can only go so far if there's no buy-in from the Muslim community to distribute that material, to let people know that it exists. It doesn't take much to share a video nowadays online, regardless of where you live. And more than likely, if you live in a place in America, I mean, by the year 2050, 1 out of 3 Americans will be a Latino. It's better that we inform them about who we are for just the sake of being healthy as a society. But as Muslims, we should go above and beyond and say, wow, we have these shared interests. These people are embracing Islam. Let's go ahead and assign some resources. And what I mean by that is not really, you know, someone from Bangladesh do the work or someone from, you know, a specific country, I don't know, Morocco, just do the work, or somebody from Africa do the work. Enable those people from their own communities who speak the language of their people to go back to their people. And that is very keen and important, because oftentimes we find communities wanting to say, hey, we're going to do something, but whoever they put in the front will not be a coherent representation to those people they want to reach. So in Islam, we understand that, you know, the creator of the heavens and the earth sent a messenger speaking in the language of their people. And it's not just linguistic, it's cultural understanding in order to convey the message for them. So as a community, we need to look at who is willing to do that. Organizations such as IslamInSpanish, we could partner to collaborate. We'll produce the material. We will look at this data and put together the programs. All people have to do who are Muslim, who are not Latino, is take a look at that, and instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, say, hey, let's go ahead and see how we can work together, you know, share some of these resources that are being created, or get to know one another in order that we complete one another and not necessarily compete with one another.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you all for being part of this very important discussion, including our audience. Please share this information with your network and be an ambassador for the facts. A link to the research is going to be shared in the chat, and then will also be a part of a follow-up email. And just keep us in your inbox. You can sign up for our mailing list, so you'll be the first to know about our upcoming research. And then finally, please respond to this poll that just was launched on your views of the presentation today. And then the final thing I'll say, the last thing, is register for our upcoming webinar on Native American Muslim stories. Thank you very much and have a beautiful day. Peace be upon you.